This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. Today's show begins with Oklahoma State Livestock Economist Derrell Peel. He updates on current cattle market conditions and covers the latest on fed and feeder cattle markets. He ends with insight on current demand and a prediction on where he really anticipates prices to go this summer. We continue today's show with a statewide update from K-State College of Agriculture Dean Ernie Minton. Story topics today include hypertension awareness, early fungicide treatments for Kansas wheat, prepping the future of animal science leadership, and National Volunteer Week with Kansas 4-H. K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts rounds out today's show by discussing a connection between white-tailed deer and COVID-19. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by Derrell Peel. He is an Oklahoma State University livestock economist, and he's joining us, as he always does, about once a month for our cattle market update. So, Derrell, thank you so much for joining us today.
You bet. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. A great start to the show. And we're going to start, as we usually do, with some of our updates on some of our fed and feeder cattle markets. Anything interesting there in the last week or so?
Well, fed cattle markets, obviously we put in an a new record high early in the month of April. We're now at the end of April. These markets are kind of just sort of topping out here, and it's kind of a spring peak, I think, a little bit seasonal. But having said that, as we go forward, normally we would expect to see a $6 or $8 slide in that fed cattle price from now to late summer, around Labor Day. I don't think we'll probably see it fall that far. It's kind of plateauing here. I expect it to be more of a kind of a sideways market here going forward a little bit because the underlying trend is still up. And certainly by the time we get to the last part of the year, these markets will pick back up and go on. Feeder cattle markets just continue to charge on. They've been moving really strong, both the lightweight calves and the bigger feeder cattle, and it really doesn't seem to be anything that's going to slow that market down anytime soon.
Sure. I know our grain markets sometimes influence what we see in our cattle markets. Has there been any, disparity between the two here lately?
Well, corn markets have come down a little bit, and that's probably helping feeder cattle a little bit. Certainly there is an interaction there. Obviously, feedlots consider those feed costs as they're looking at what they got to pay for feeder cattle or what they can pay for feeder cattle. So that's part of the influence. The other thing that's probably having some impact, particularly on the lightweight stocker type calves, is the fact that we finally got some pretty widespread rains, at least in Oklahoma. I'm not 100% sure how far up into Kansas they went, but a lot of the really droughty areas have gotten some rain this past week, and that's going to be a really important thing. And the timing is excellent in terms of, jump-starting a little bit of pasture and hay production.
Yeah, we did get some significant rains, especially, like you said, in some of those really drought-stricken areas. So Southwest Kansas was hit with a significant amount of rain. If we could get a few more events like that, I think that would be much appreciated. But, of course, we're not going to complain here about rain.
Well, hopefully it's a down payment on what's coming. But, the timing is good. And like I said, it will jumpstart it. It certainly won't be enough. It doesn't get us out of the drought, but this could be an excellent start if we do get some follow through. And I know in the short run, even, it hasn't been just in the last 2 or 3 weeks. I've talked to producers that were still looking at perhaps having to liquidate some cows for lack of pasture. So this will probably buy them a little bit of time. And again, if we get the follow through, then maybe we actually salvage a fair amount of our forage season this year.
Absolutely. At this point now, I guess it's been almost a year of kind of seeing a lot of liquidation occurring. Is that fair to say that it's been about a year mark at this point?
Well, actually, I mean, in a broad sense for the whole industry, we've been liquidating pretty heavy for the last 2 years. And so even though the drought was worse this last year in the central and southern plains, but the year before that, the drought was particularly pronounced up in the northern plains and in the eastern Rocky Mountain region. And so, if you look at the total numbers for the U.S., we've liquidated both cows and heifers the last 2 years, and the slaughter rates were way up, and that's what's beginning to change now. And if we continue to see some improvement in the drought conditions, where we could actually sort of, kind of get past the drought, if you will. We're not really there yet, but we might be heading towards that. Then we'll see a substantial turnaround in this thing in terms of producers switching from coping with drought to maybe thinking about what comes after that in terms of rebuilding and recuperating from the drought.
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully it lends to thriving, environments for our producers instead of what we've been dealing with, for sure. And, the other side of this, the flip side, is kind of the demand that we've seen. So I think we often reference the box beef cutout when we think about that in some ways. So what have we really seen there in that market?
The box beef cutout has continued to strengthen this spring, generally speaking. And underneath that, when you sort of analyze beef demand, retail prices have remained very steady for really all of last year and so far this year. So we just continue to see signs that this beef demand is very resilient. Obviously, there are some challenges there and some concerns, and so we're monitoring it closely, but we just don't see a lot of signs of weakness there. When beef prices, they're fairly expensive now, they're probably going to get pushed a little bit higher here, because going forward, we're now going to see supply issues that support those markets. Beef production is beginning to fall, and will fall farther as we go forward, not only for the rest of this year, but for for next year as well. So for many months ahead, we're going to see tighter beef supplies, and that's going to push these prices higher. And we look for signs that consumers, just can't take anymore. But we just don't see that yet. There's no real sign of what we call trading down, consumers making dramatic shifts from higher valued products to lower valued products. I'm sure some of that's happening, and I think we will see some of that as we go forward, because inevitably, and of course, there's just going to be less beef. So there will be some rationing that takes place in this market, and some consumers will, to some extent at least, be priced out of the market. But all in all, beef demand is just continues to be very resilient and to continue very strong.
Excellent. Yeah. And I know there's some seasonality, obviously, with demand, especially for beef. And we're starting to see that seasonality pick up now. The demand would be higher. When does that really start to drop off in a normal year, per se?
In terms of the overall box beef, we do see, strength going into, grilling season. And that really, from a wholesale level, starts in April, because usually the buying at the wholesale level is about a month ahead of the retail sales. So we're buying now through late April into early May for the Memorial Day weekend. And we're seeing some of that seasonal demand. Overall. Now, beef obviously is lots of different products. So if you look at individual products, they have different seasonality. And ground beef is obviously important during grilling season, and those prices have been going up if you look at the trimmings markets and so on. And then things like strip steaks, for example, tend to be a very popular grilling item. There's other ones, if you look at our most valuable products like tenderloins, they're actually more of a fall and winter kind of a thing, because that's when folks go to restaurants and eat in at the expensive restaurants. So there's a little seasonal weakness in those markets. But overall, the seasonality for boxed beef in a carcass kind of sense is stronger now going into the grilling season, and that'll last through Labor Day, and then we'll see it drop off a little bit in the fall.
Now that we've kind of talked about, local demand and things of that nature, when we think about international trade on a larger scale here, it's been fairly quiet recently, right?
Well, yeah, it has been fairly quiet. Of course, we haven't had any data. Now we're almost due for another month's data. But the early months of 2023, exports have weakened just a little bit. They actually started weakening a little bit in late 2022. And we sort of expected that. The exchange rate issues have been a headwind. And some of that's actually been a little better. The dollar has actually come back down relative to other currencies in some cases. So that's actually improved a bit. But there's going to be less beef. These wholesale values continue to go up. So we're fully expecting that we certainly won't set another record level for beef exports in 2023 following 2022. But at the same time, I don't think there's any really broad-based collapse, if you will, in the international demand as well. It's just going to step back a little bit, I think, from record levels.
Like you said, we'll have a new report coming out here in the next week or so, honestly. I think a week and a half.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
we'll hear that data soon and talk through that, I'm sure, on this show here in the future. But Derrell, I know you are very good about writing, articles that keep up to date with timely information for anyone that is looking to learn more about our markets. So if listeners are tuning in and they're wanting to maybe follow along more closely with you or hear more from you, where can they do that at?
I tell you, the easiest way, I do write a weekly newsletter along with some of my animal science colleagues. It's called the Cow-Calf Corner that we produce out of Oklahoma State University. And really, if folks are interested in getting that directly, they could send me an email at derrell.peel@okstate.edu and just tell me that you'd like to get on the newsletter list, and we'll be happy to add you to that to get that every Monday morning.
Wonderful. A great resource for sure for anyone out there looking for more information from Derrell, again, on our cattle markets. Derrell's email and the link to the latest cow-calf newsletter from Oklahoma State University will be linked in today's show notes, which, of course, as always, can be found on agtoday.net. Derrell, as always, thank you so much for your time today and for joining us.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was Oklahoma State Livestock Economist Derrell Peel joining us for this week's Cattle Market Update. We're cutting to a short break now, but the rest of the show is still full of great content on agriculture today. We are going to be joined by Dean Ernie Minton of K-State's College of Agriculture. He, of course, is joining us for this April's edition of Statewide. Statewide is a monthly update on all of the latest happenings in the College of Agriculture here at K-State, and he has 4 amazing stories that you're not going to want to miss out on this month. Following Statewide with Dean Ernie Minton, we're going to be closing out today's show with a wildlife segment with K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. This week, Drew provides insight on the interesting link between COVID and white-tailed deer. It's a conversation you're not going to want to miss out on. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by the Dean of K-State's College of Agriculture, Dean Ernie Minton. And he's joining us today, as he always does, once a month to talk through some of the latest stories coming out of the College of Ag here at K-State. So, Dean Minton, thanks so much for joining us for this edition of April Statewide.
Hey, Samantha, I'm happy to be here.
Absolutely happy to have you. And we have 4 excellent stories to go through today. And the first one is really K-State's effort to bring awareness to hypertension. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, I think maybe a good number of your listeners, Samantha, will identify K-State Research and Extension as a link to many programs related to food and agriculture, natural resources. But another very, very important thing that our specialists become involved in and agents is community health and programs that support that. And so hypertension or high blood pressure is a really, really important medical issue that is particularly threatening because it doesn't make itself known. You don't necessarily know, or you wouldn't normally know, that you have hypertension or high blood pressure. And so getting ahead of that is really very, very important. So this is where our extension personnel have developed programs to come in and help with that.
Hypertension or high blood pressure, like you said, kind of known as the silent killer, right?
That's exactly right, because, again, you don't know that problem is lurking until something else happens, and certainly want to avoid that.
Then our next story, a bit of a different switch here. We're going more to the ag side with this next one. Our K-State Extension specialists are advising that Kansas wheat, to help it a bit this year, treatments with early fungicide use might be a great option this year.
Yeah, I think that this is an important one, particularly as we look at probably the variability of the development of the wheat crop across the state. I think folks are familiar with the challenges that our wheat growers in southwest Kansas are having with a different problem, and that is the lack of moisture. But I think this article really points for those who have a good stand and have the opportunity for a good harvest can really make a difference between one that's good and one that could be improved dramatically. And Kelsey Anderson-Onofree has some nice tips for our wheat growers relative to fungicide application, which should be worth a good read.
Absolutely. Yeah, she serves as our wheat pathologist here at K-State, of course, and she's an excellent resource to always look towards with any of those wheat disease questions that producers out there might have. And our next story also stays within the College of Ag here and our classrooms, really. And this is a program that's really set to help future animal science leaders within the industry. So tell us a bit about that program.
Yeah, Animal Science has a really nice program that's open to a limited number of high school students that are interested in livestock-related careers, known as the Animal Science Leadership Academy, and is June 21 to 24 in Manhattan. And I'd say the department does a really, really good job of incorporating leadership opportunities for incoming students. They're really very, very proud of that, and one that would add quite a bit of value to an incoming student's portfolio if they can become a part of that. So I encourage your listeners to encourage prospective students to take a look at that.
Absolutely. Yeah, we spoke with some of the leaders that are a part of that program not too long ago here on Ag Today. And this is really an opportunity for them to see, what the industry really holds, the animal science industry really holds when it comes to careers and things like that, but also kind of what college life is like here at K-State.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it's a mixture of workshops, tours, and they'll be paired too with our faculty mentors who are K-State professors, and a really, really great experience for a high schooler to gain that knowledge and also, have that on their resume as they complete college and look at what's next for them. It's a great program.
An opportunity that's, not everyone will have on their resume as they go to enter into the workforce in the future. And also one that, like you mentioned, connecting them with K-State professors, specialists here. It's an opportunity for them to network even and explore maybe fields they're potentially interested in.
Yeah, I think so, because I think there are, some students that come into that Leadership Academy that are very, very familiar with the breadth of opportunities there are in animal science, and then others maybe that aren't as familiar. And so pairing with that mentor, talking about opportunities in livestock and livestock-related industries, this really is a great opportunity for students.
Last week was actually National Volunteer Week, and we celebrated that here at K-State, especially with our friends over in Kansas 4-H, because they have a lot to celebrate that week.
Oh, they certainly do. The 4-H program is one of those very, very signature youth development programs that our Extension Service boasts, and it's just such a tremendous opportunity to develop young people. The thing is, it is built upon the dedication of a team. To say a team implies that it's small, but it's not. It's a great number of folks that volunteer, make sure our 4-H programs are delivered appropriately. So, yeah, this was a particularly important week in terms of National Volunteer Week that really has a great impact on the state as well.
Yeah, I've noticed with, speaking with some of our Kansas 4-H leaders here on campus that it really has this kind of beautiful feedback loop. These children are invested in throughout their childhood, and then as they grow up and they enter into careers or industry, whatever they may do, they really have this passion in them to continue giving back to the organization that gave so much to them.
Yeah, I think so. I think, they learn that. That's one of those learn by observing and then doing kinds of activities. And because of the dedication of those volunteers, it really has, and this article points that out, a significant monetary value, too, when you break it down in terms of those terms. But then that impact that pays forward in terms of, I think, more productive citizens going forward is another value built into that program as well.
Can't place a monetary number on that for sure. It's something that goes far beyond money in any instance, like you've said. And, Dean Minton, you also mentioned that these are articles, and that's exactly what Statewide is. It's this monthly newsletter of articles that you send out, and it's a great opportunity to really stay up to date with what's going on here at the College of Ag. So if listeners are tuning in and they're like, oh, I had no idea that Statewide was an option for me to, get sent to my email box every month, how can they really subscribe to that?
I think all they need to do is let us know here, either in the dean's office or in Dr. Hadley's office, Director of Extension, and we'll make sure that they get on that list.
Absolutely. A great opportunity for you all tuning in that want to stay up to date with the latest happenings here at K-State and the College of Agriculture. And I believe there's also an online subscription link as well. So I'll be able to put that in the show notes of today's show, which as always can be found on agtoday.net. But Dean Minton, as always, thank you so much for joining us today.
Samantha, I enjoyed it and always interested in sharing these great stories with your listeners.
Well, I know they appreciate it as well. Once again, everyone, that was Dean of the K-State College of Agriculture, Dean Ernie Minton, joining us for this April's edition of Statewide. Also, we're about to cut to a short break, but before we do, a coalition of livestock groups, including the Kansas Livestock Association and the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, have filed a complaint in the Western District of Texas against the Department of the Interior and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Scarlett Hagans from KLA joins us now to share more information.
The coalition, which also includes partners in the oil and gas industry, is suing to overturn the listing on the grounds that it is not science-based, hinders voluntary conservation work, and exceeds the federal government's authority. In addition to the push in court, U.S. Congressman Tracy Mann and U.S. Senator Roger Marshall are leading a bicameral effort to overturn the listing under the Congressional Review Act. To aid this endeavor, Don Heineman, a rancher from Dighton and past KLA president, testified before a subcommittee of the U.S. House Committee on Natural Resources, encouraging them to approve House Joint Resolution 29, which would provide for congressional disapproval of the Fish and Wildlife Service final rule. Heineman told the committee if the rule stands, it not only will adversely affect his operation and those of his neighbors, but also hinder further recovery of the lesser prairie chicken by disregarding successful voluntary efforts and implementing burdensome regulations. One such regulation is requiring landowners in the northern distinct population segment, which includes Kansas, to follow a site-specific grazing plan developed by a service-approved party to get incidental take protection. During his testimony, Heineman told the subcommittee that not only is the Fish and Wildlife Service forcing ranchers to subject their management decisions to a government-approved third party with no ranching experience, but as of today, the agency has designated only 3 service-approved parties, none of which are located in Kansas. This lack of any meaningful incidental take mechanism leaves ranchers exposed to severe fines despite having managed their land for years to sustain the existing lesser prairie chicken populations. The U.S. House Committee on Natural Resources is expected to take up the legislation in the next few weeks. I'm Scarlett Hagans.
Once again, that was the Kansas Livestock Association's Scarlett Hagans. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today, and we are ending this Monday's programming with our wildlife segment for the week. And joining us for that this week is K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts. Today we're going to be discussing white-tailed deer and COVID, Drew. Interesting conversation ahead of us.
Yeah, and I'm sure that COVID is the last thing people want to listen to on a wildlife program, but I thought it would be an interesting topic for us to cover today.
Especially because there's a fairly high percentage of deer in the upper Midwest specifically that have been found to be positive for COVID, right?
Yeah, that's true. So starting in 2021, the USDA and some researchers at universities as well started testing deer in 4 states in the upper Midwest for COVID, and they found that up to 40% of the deer in some populations tested positive.
Interesting. So these strains that were found in deer, were they the same strains we were kind of seeing play out in our human population?
They were. So some of the early ones were the Alpha and Delta and Gamma that we heard about. But they also found the Omicron variant in deer as well. And one of the interesting things that they found was that these variants or strains would be present in a deer population fairly long after they were extinct in people, with COVID. And so what we're kind of seeing there potentially is that white-tailed deer can be a reservoir for variants that are no longer spreading in humans.
Interesting. And that's why we're kind of monitoring white-tailed deer as this COVID situation dies down in our human populations, but there's still an area of concern for deer specifically.
There is. And when we have a zoonotic disease, which is a disease that can pass from animals to people or from people back to animals, and it doesn't necessarily cause an animal to get sick or potentially die, then that's where a virus or whatever kind of disease organism it is can sit there and mutate in that species. And that's oftentimes where variants come from, like that nasty Omicron variant that went around. And so it's important for us to continue to sample deer and look for potential variants of concern in the future that may arise from deer infected with COVID.
Sure. So carriers of sorts, these animals.
Yeah. And reservoirs is the term that we would use for that in disease ecology.
Wonderful. Good to know. So the answer here, we're not trying to say, stay away from white-tailed deer, right?
Right. Yeah. And that was one of the things that several of my friends who hunt brought up when this first came out was, are they going to try and keep us from hunting deer now? And no, that's not what it is at all. If you're someone who is at risk because of an underlying health issue with COVID and that sort of thing, then maybe you want to take extra precautions when handling a dead deer. But really the reason that we're concerned about this is thinking about the future and potential impacts on human health.
Sure. So this monitoring, you've mentioned, is it wildlife, ecologists that are out there looking through these tests, going out and randomly sampling deer? Is that what this looks like?
It's not. So most of the sampling that's been done for COVID in white-tailed deer populations has been hunter-harvested animals. And so after an animal is harvested, lots of states have check stations. And so, a hunter would come into the check station, and one of the biologists that's there at the check station to look at age, sex, and all those other characteristics of the harvested deer would take a nasal swab at that point. And that's how they're collecting the samples from the deer.
Interesting. And, this topic is one that is obviously going to be evolving as time goes on. But if there's any potential concern or, looking for updates out there from listeners, is there a way to kind of maybe stay up to date on this information?
The USDA is who's funding most of this research and tracking it. They've got a branch called Wildlife Services, which is under APHIS, or the Animal Plant and Health Inspection Service. And so if you just Google COVID and white-tailed deer, their results for this study are one of the very first things that pop up.
Wow. Super interesting, Drew. A topic we wouldn't think to be talking about still to this day. I think COVID for many is kind of in the past, but a reminder that, there's still potential out there.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, Drew, thanks so much again for joining us today. I really appreciate your time.
Yep. Thanks for having me, Samantha.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts, again joining us for this week's Wildlife Update, speaking on white-tailed deer and COVID. We'll be back with more tomorrow on Agriculture Today.